Nestled high above Lake Albano, surrounded by vineyards and pines, Castel Gandolfo has long been the pastoral retreat of popes. For centuries it has served as a place of prayer, rest and reflection, a bridge between the grandeur of Rome and the simplicity of nature. But when Pope Francis chose to forgo this summer ritual, Castel Gandolfo's gate stayed shut, its gardens silent. This summer, however, those gates have reopened. Pope Leo XIV has returned to Castel Gandolfo, and with him, a centuries-old tradition springs back to life. Imagine a golden sunrise spilling across the Alban Hills, the silhouette of the papal palace, its baroque facade softened by morning mist. A light breeze stirs the gardens where popes once walked in contemplation. At the heart of this scene, Papa Leo, reflecting at a small wooden table overlooking the lake, liturgical breviary in hand. He is not here for ceremony or public spectacle. He is here to restore a spiritual rhythm undone only 6 years ago. Why does it matter? Castel Gandolfo isn't merely an opulent summer home. It's a lived symbol. It's where popes like Pius XII and Paul VI found balance between ecclesial leadership and personal renewal. It's where countless writers, travelers and pilgrims have glimpsed the human side of papal life. In returning to this tradition, Leo XIV is not invoking nostalgia. He is reclaiming a practice that nourishes the soul of the Church. His choice raises a question. What is gained when tradition is restored? Are we witnessing a retreat into the past? Or is this a step forward toward a Catholicism that embraces its roots without abandoning its mission? To answer that, we must first remember why the tradition was paused. Pope Francis, in a radical gesture of simplicity, chose to remain in Vatican City during the sweltering Roman summers. His decision resonated, declaring solidarity with priests living in heat-stricken parishes, signaling pastoral humility. Yet not everyone saw it that way. Doubts surfaced. Did the absence of a papal presence in those hills create a spiritual void? Did it remove a visual anchor that reminded the faithful even the busiest shepherd needs time apart? Now enters Pope Leo XIV. Skipping into the Vatican Gardens one July afternoon, he publicly announced his intention. The Church must remember that rest is not luxury, but necessity, and sacred rhythm belongs to our identity. His words were met with careful applause from some, cautious approval from others. The stage was set for a return unlike any before, quiet, prayerful and intentional. It began subtly. First week of July. Vatican aides prepare the summer apartment, rooms freshened with linen, windows opened to bring breezes in. Meals planned around simplicity, grilled fish, local vegetables, prayerful silence. Official schedules include morning prayer, midday meditation, evening readings. Informal outings are unannounced, maybe a walk into town, a stop at a local chapel, a cup of gelato shared with the papal secretary. No cameras, no crowds. Yet, as photojournalists note, Castel Gandolfo feels alive again. Its church bells have resumed ringing. Local staff speak of renewed energy. Pilgrims wait at the old gates, hoping for a glimpse. Roof terraces host prayer vigils. Lakeside paths see silent pilgrims walking with folded hands. It's modest, it's subtle, and it's powerful. This return isn't about nostalgia, it's about rhythm. In a hyper-connected church where digital demands never sleep, pauses matter. Leo XIV is modeling something, that the pastoral call includes resting the soul. That spiritual presence in ministry requires spiritual renewal in stillness, and that leaders, yes, even popes, need to learn again the sacred grammar of silence. But Castel Gandolfo isn't a museum. It's a working habitat, gardens to tend, liturgies to pray, spaces to reflect. Leo XIV's schedule reads like a monastic rule. Lauds at dawn, midday meals in quiet, sacred reading before Vesper. Afternoon nap, trot around vineyards, supper in the courtyard. Evening prayers under the stars, whispered in Latin, Italian, and sometimes Spanish, memory of his Peruvian ministry. It's the contrast we don't often see, the pastoral shepherd embracing solitude. It's a reminder that visible leadership requires invisible formation, and it's unfolding not behind closed doors but gently in the open. People already feel it. Vatican officials report staff noticeably less ragged, more centered. Journalists covering the Vatican say they find a calm in the compound. Even Roman farmers speak of sense of blessing returning to that hillside parish they call the papal neighborhood. This is part one. The return of Castel Gandolfo has begun, lodged in a purpose more profound than headline appeal. It is a story about tradition renewed with intention, about leadership receptive to rhythm, about a pope teaching anew that soul can't sprint forever. It must walk, pause, breathe. The decision to return to Castel Gandolfo did not happen in a vacuum. It was preceded by quiet conversations, careful planning, and a deeply personal discernment that Pope Leo XIV carried alone for months. In reviving a tradition so intimately associated with papal history, he wasn't making a nostalgic statement. He was embracing a rhythm that had once defined the Church's balance between contemplation and action. To fully understand this decision, we must consider the contrast that preceded it. When Pope Francis assumed the papacy in 2013, he chose to break away from a number of long-standing customs. Among the most visible was his refusal to reside in the Apostolic Palace, opting instead for the modest Domus Sanctae Marthae guest house. In a similar spirit, he abandoned the summer retreat to Castel Gandolfo, citing the importance of remaining close to the people, especially those in sweltering dioceses around the world who could not escape the heat. He viewed the papal summer break not as a necessity, but as a privilege to be laid aside. For many, this choice symbolized humility, simplicity, and solidarity with the poor. It sent a powerful message that the Church's leader did not need a palace or a summer estate to do his work. And yet, it also left something missing. When Castel Gandolfo closed its papal apartments and shifted to functioning primarily as a museum and visitor attraction, the change was felt beyond the Vatican walls. Locals in the surrounding region lost the gentle rhythm of seeing the Holy Father's presence in their town. Staff who had worked at the estate for decades were reassigned or retired, and faithful pilgrims lost a visible sign of the Church's humanity, a place where popes prayed, rested, and breathed the same country air as the people they served. In theological circles, some expressed concern that the disappearance of the papal retreat suggested a troubling shift in the Church's understanding of rest. Was leisure now considered unspiritual? Could the shepherd never step away to find his own still waters? Pope Leo XIV, having grown up in a modest home and having worked with the poor in Latin America, understood the weight of Francis's example. But he also understood something else. That rest, properly understood, is not luxury. It is restoration, and it is deeply scriptural. From the earliest days of his pontificate, Leo XIV emphasized the value of Sabbath, not just as a commandment, but as a gift. He often quoted the Psalms during his early addresses, noting the way the shepherd makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. For Leo, the image wasn't one of detachment, but of preparation. Leaders need to be renewed, not for themselves, but for the sake of those they serve. So when he quietly initiated plans to return to Castel Gandolfo, it wasn't to reverse his predecessor's simplicity, it was to deepen it. He wanted the Church to see that withdrawal can be an act of love, that stepping back can prepare one to step forward more generously. The response within the Vatican was quietly supportive. Cardinal advisors, many of whom had served under both Francis and Benedict XVI, recognized the wisdom in reviving the retreat, not as a display of privilege, but as a pastoral practice. The Pope's body needs rest, one senior aide said, but more than that, his spirit needs rhythm. So preparations began. A skeleton staff returned to the papal villa, not to host receptions, but to care for the garden, maintain the chapel, and prepare simple meals. Gone were the days of formal banquets and visiting diplomats. In their place, evening walks, handwritten prayers, and gentle conversations with a handful of visiting theologians and religious brothers. Pope Leo XIV made one request, that the estate be treated not as a palace, but as a cloister. He wanted the rhythm of Castel Gandolfo to resemble that of a monastery, not closed off from the world, but attuned to the heartbeat of creation. Time spent among olive groves and vineyards, with scripture open and distractions set aside, became his way of realigning with the deeper mission of the papacy. Observers noticed the difference immediately. Unlike previous popes who had hosted press gatherings or delivered summer addresses from the villa balcony, Leo remained quiet. He asked that photos not be taken without permission. The few images that emerged were candid, him walking alone at sunrise, seated under a cypress tree, or visiting the nearby parish church in plain white cassock and sandals. For the local townspeople of Castel Gandolfo, the return of the papal presence was more than ceremonial. it was deeply emotional. Shopkeepers placed small signs in windows, Bentornato, Santo Padre. A florist left a white rose at the villa gate each morning. Children drew pictures of the Pope and pinned them to the town bulletin board. Though Leo made no formal appearances, his presence was deeply felt. And it wasn't only in Castel Gandolfo. Around the world, Catholics took notice. Some viewed his return as a hopeful sign that the Church was rediscovering its contemplative roots. Others appreciated that Leo XIV wasn't trying to undo Francis's humility, but to balance it with tradition. One journalist wrote, "He has not changed the tune, he has simply returned a missing note." Theologians and spiritual writers began exploring the implications. Essays appeared in journals and blogs with titles like Rest as Prophetic Witness and The Return to Sacred Rhythm. Many pointed out that in a frenetic age of constant communication, the Pope's withdrawal offered a counter-cultural witness, that silence, solitude, and reflection are not escapes from responsibility, but tools of faithful leadership. In one homily before leaving for Castel Gandolfo, Leo said this, "To retreat is not to resign, it is to recharge. Even our Lord, before every great work, went away to pray, and so must we." These words became the unofficial motto of his summer, printed in church bulletins, shared on social media, and cited in parish newsletters. It wasn't a grand theological pronouncement. It was simple, real, necessary. Because in the end, Leo XIV's return to Castel Gandolfo is not about a place. It's about a pattern, a rhythm, a sacramental sense that time itself must be consecrated, not just in labor, but in stillness. Not just in proclamation, but in quiet trust that God is found in rest just as surely as in mission. This is what Part 2 reveals. Not a return to privilege, but a return to balance. Not a break from the people, but a deeper turn toward them, through the ancient path of solitude. Pope Leo XIV, in stepping into the silence of Castel Gandolfo, is reminding the Church of something it forgot when the gates first closed. That retreat can be its own form of witness. As the sun dipped below the hills surrounding Lake Albano, casting golden hues across the villa's ancient stone, a gentle breeze stirred the olive trees lining the garden paths. Inside the quiet of Castel Gandolfo, Pope Leo XIV sat in quiet reflection, not composing encyclicals or meeting diplomats, but simply listening, to birdsong, to wind, to the beating of his own heart in prayer. And in that quiet, he was offering something the modern papacy has rarely embraced so completely: stillness as a form of service. Throughout his stay, there were no scheduled audiences, no media briefings, no declarations. The Pope's calendar reflected a monastic simplicity. Each day began at dawn with lauds, followed by silent meditation near the Orchard Chapel. Breakfast was taken alone or with a close aide, usually accompanied by spiritual readings. St. Francis de Sales, St. Catherine of Siena, and, more often than not, the Psalms. His afternoons were devoted to long walks along the lakefront trail, where local fishermen had grown used to seeing a quiet figure in white pass slowly with his head bowed in prayer. They didn't approach him, but they often waved. The Pope, in turn, lifted a hand in silent blessing. These small gestures of mutual reverence became the unspoken liturgy of the hills. At midday, he returned to the villa for lunch, a simple meal of seasonal vegetables often grown in the palace's own gardens. There was no wine, no lavish spreads, only what was necessary. In the silence of those meals, Leo XIV practiced a kind of spiritual fasting, not of food, but of noise. Evening hours were set aside for spiritual reading and private writing, not for publication, but for inner clarity. His journals, aides say, were filled not with strategies, but with questions. How can I love more simply? How can the Church listen more fully? What does holiness look like in exhaustion? These reflections, carried in silence, soon began to shape the life around him. His aides, once accustomed to the relentless pace of Vatican affairs, began to mirror his calm. Conversations grew slower, more thoughtful. The entire rhythm of the papal household shifted, not out of command, but through example. Aides prayed more, secretaries spoke less. Even the villa staff, gardeners, cooks, cleaners, found themselves drawn into the peace that surrounded the Holy Father. But the ripples didn't stop at the villa's edge. Castel Gandolfo itself, once a sleepy tourist town with a museum in the place of papal presence, began to feel alive again. Parish priests noticed an increase in mass attendance. Shopkeepers reported a gentler tone among visitors. Local youth groups organized pilgrimages to the gates, not to see the Pope, but to pray near where he prayed. A subtle spiritual magnetism had returned, not because of pageantry, but because of authenticity. The people weren't drawn to Leo XIV for his authority, they were drawn to his humanity. In a time when leadership is often defined by control, he was showing a different way: leadership by surrender. Spiritual directors around the world took notice. Retreat centers reported an uptick in registrations. Jesuit houses, Benedictine monasteries, and lay contemplative communities began crafting new resources for restful discernment, inspired by the Pope's silent witness. One retreat director wrote, "He reminded us that contemplation isn't a retreat from the world, it's how we return to it properly." In homilies across Europe and Latin America, priests began referencing his sabbatical not as a curious news item, but as a spiritual invitation. "The Holy Father is not on vacation," one bishop preached. "He is in retreat, and if the Vicar of Christ needs retreat, what makes us think we don't?" Even outside of Catholic circles, the return to Castel Gandolfo stirred conversation. Protestant pastors, Orthodox priests, even some secular commentators remarked on the beauty of Leo XIV's gesture. It was rare to see a global leader step away, not for scandal or exhaustion, but for soul work. In an age of constant performance, his decision to rest, openly, unapologetically, was itself countercultural. His example quietly challenged a culture that equates presence with productivity. It reintroduced the notion that purpose is not always visible, that the most important labor may be invisible to the world. In his silence, Pope Leo was not absent, he was becoming more present than ever. The natural world became his sanctuary. He often spoke softly to gardeners, asking the names of plants, blessing trees that had shaded pontiffs for generations. He studied the habits of bees near the monastery wall. He sat for long stretches by the lake, letting his thoughts settle like silt in still water. From this stillness came something profound. A renewed conviction that renewal itself must be modeled, not just taught, not just preached, but lived. In a church often strained by administrative demands and spiritual fatigue, Leo XIV was embodying what it looked like to slow down for the sake of the Spirit. He did not offer programs or initiatives, he did not announce reforms or conferences. He offered a presence that asked nothing, yet gave everything. The act of being at Castel Gandolfo fully, silently, sacredly became the reform. It called others to examine their own pace, their own purpose, their own understanding of time. It also rekindled a theology of place. Castel Gandolfo was not holy because of architecture or history. It became holy again because a soul met God there. Because in one summer, a pope chose to let the land, the silence, and the rhythm of prayer reshape his heart. And so it remains, day after day, the quiet rituals continue. Lauds at dawn, walks at dusk, scripture read by candlelight, and the lake, always waiting, always whispering back the only words needed. Be still, be present, be renewed. As word of Pope Leo XIV's presence at Castel Gandolfo spread, slowly, softly, like incense on a breeze, the response within the wider church and among lay communities began to deepen. It wasn't marked by applause or spectacle, but by a kind of quiet recognition. People understood, almost intuitively, that something important was taking place, not just at the papal villa, but within the heart of the church itself. In dioceses across the world, bishops began incorporating themes of rest, contemplation, and rhythm into their pastoral letters. Retreat houses reported a rise in inquiries from parish priests and catechists eager to rediscover silence as part of their vocation. In places like Kerala, Manila, and Buenos Aires, spiritual workshops titled "Following the Pope into the Quiet" appeared, led by local clergy who saw the retreat not as detachment, but as divine modeling. What made Leo XIV's retreat so unique was its lack of branding. There were no public relations teams crafting narratives, no Vatican statements trying to explain his every move. In fact, the Vatican's press office was unusually restrained, offering only the briefest acknowledgement that the Pope had chosen to spend a period of contemplative rest in the traditional summer residence. But it was precisely this restraint that gave his actions power. People filled in the space with imagination, reverence, and reflection. The absence of daily headlines allowed the gesture to breathe, to settle, to inspire. Within the Roman Curia, the effect was similarly understated but unmistakable. Departments accustomed to instant feedback and constant schedules began to slow. Meetings were trimmed. Email chains grew shorter. An unofficial memo encouraged staff to practice liturgical time in their own lives, not as vacation, but as a way of recovering their own spiritual interiority. In the Congregation for Bishops, one official began each morning by praying a decade of the Rosary in silence before opening his files. Another, in the Dicastery for Evangelization, began walking to work through the Vatican gardens instead of rushing via corridor. They weren't mimicking the Pope. They were being drawn into the same rhythm. This quiet transformation spilled into the parishes. In rural Ireland, a pastor turned one Sunday Mass into a liturgy of stillness, incorporating longer pauses between readings and silent reflection before the Eucharist. In Cameroon, a youth minister turned off all screens for a weekend retreat and titled it the Gandolfo Challenge. In Chicago, a Jesuit high school offered an elective called Prayer in the Age of Noise, citing the Pope's summer as inspiration. These gestures weren't coordinated. They weren't mandated from Rome. They simply happened because something had shifted in the spiritual atmosphere. Leo XIV had given permission through presence alone for the Church to pause without apology. And while most Catholic faithful would never step foot near Castel Gandolfo, many felt they were there in spirit. The photos that did emerge, rare, reverent, often distant, only fueled the fascination. One image, taken from a discreet vantage point, showed the Pope kneeling by a lakeside bench at dusk, his white cassock touched by shadow, his hands clasped before a small travel crucifix. It was shared thousands of times online, captioned not with politics, but with prayer. Among youth, especially those often skeptical of church hierarchy, the Pope's retreat generated a surprising wave of curiosity. Why would a man with so much power just disappear into the hills? One teen asked during a confirmation prep session in California. His catechist answered, because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is be quiet. That quiet began to form the heart of homilies, blogs, journal reflections, and even poems. Catholic artists illustrated the villa not as a palace, but as a sanctuary, sometimes adding scriptural references like, "Come away by yourselves and rest a while," Mark 6:31. One popular Catholic musician released a song titled Return to the Lake, blending acoustic simplicity with chants from the Divine Office. The global response wasn't uniform. Some critics questioned the return to a seemingly opulent space at a time when the Church still faced poverty and scandal. But these voices were few and often tempered by the broader appreciation that Leo XIV wasn't luxuriating, he was retreating, and his retreat bore fruit. Perhaps the clearest indication came not from any official statement, but from a handwritten note pinned to the iron gate of Castel Gandolfo by a pilgrim from Poland. It read, "You don't need to wave to us, you don't need to speak. Just stay here, because when you stay, we remember how to stay with God too." That simple note, later discovered by villa staff and preserved in the archives, said everything that needed saying. In his stillness, Leo XIV had managed to lead. In his silence, he had reminded the Church of its voice. Not a voice of noise or urgency, but of rhythm, reverence, and rest. A voice that could call the world not to action, but to alignment. Not to frenzy, but to faith. And the world was listening. The grounds of Castel Gandolfo had always borne the echoes of sacred history, whispers of decisions, declarations, and devotions made by popes past. But this summer, under the steady gaze of Pope Leo XIV, the ancient estate was no longer a relic of a bygone era. It had become a living witness once more, a sanctuary where the act of resting in God became a statement louder than any encyclical. Throughout the rolling countryside, a stillness had taken hold. Even the trees seemed to lean inward. Under their shade, Leo XIV walked slowly, often alone, rosary in hand, murmuring prayers barely audible to the breezes that carried them. Yet the effect of this silence, this almost monastic presence, reached far beyond the villa walls. In monasteries and convents, religious communities began referencing the Pope's summer rhythm in their morning readings. Benedictines in Bavaria added a short prayer of thanksgiving for leaders who remember the need for holy rest. Dominican novices in Mexico fasted from conversation during their afternoon work, dedicating their silence to those overwhelmed by spiritual exhaustion. Across continents, a subtle theology of pause was emerging. It wasn't new, but it had been forgotten. For centuries, Catholic spirituality had been anchored in the idea of rhythm, the liturgical year, the hours of the day, the seasons of the soul. But modernity had eroded these contours, replacing prayerful pacing with relentless productivity. Pope Leo XIV's retreat served as a gentle yet profound corrective. Even non-religious observers noted the shift. A columnist in The New Yorker described the retreat as the most radical political act of the summer. In an op-ed titled "The Pope Who Went Silent," they wrote, "By withdrawing without crisis, Leo has reclaimed a space for sacred rest that modern leadership has rendered obsolete." It was, in their view, a pastoral poem written in footsteps and silence. Catholic universities responded with new academic courses, one titled "The Sabbatical Pope, Theology of Withdrawal," another examining the link between sacred geography and spiritual formation. Pilgrims began writing to Castel Gandolfo, not requesting blessings, but sharing stories of how they too were rediscovering Sabbath. One letter read, "Holy Father, your stillness woke me up." In families, the change was quieter, but no less meaningful. Parents introduced sacred silence times in their homes. Children were taught to sit quietly for 10 minutes each day, just to listen, to nature, to their breathing, to God. One mother from Ontario wrote to her parish priest saying, "My children know who the Pope is not because he speaks, but because he is quiet." For clergy, it became a moment of self-examination. Pastors who had pushed themselves through burnout began carving out personal retreats inspired by Leo's witness. Confessors started recommending periods of stillness as penance, not as punishment, but as presence. Some parishes added 15 minutes of silence before Mass, allowing worshippers to enter with reverence instead of rush. Even bishops, often bound to bureaucratic rhythms, took notice. Several began visiting local hermitages. Others shortened their calendars, citing the Pope's sabbatical as spiritual precedents. In a private meeting with curial leaders, one cardinal remarked, "He has not spoken, but he has preached, and we are the ones who must now listen." Liturgically, the Church began to mirror his rhythm. More parishes adopted extended pauses after readings. Some dioceses encouraged simplified summer liturgies, not stripped of reverence, but free from performance. Choirs leaned into chant. Altars were adorned with simpler vestments. The Church in her worship was breathing again. The effect on vocations was striking. Several seminaries reported new applicants citing Leo's retreat as a catalyst. "He made priesthood seem like something sacred again," wrote one young man from Manila. "Not management, not media, but mystery. And I want to live inside that." Pope Leo himself never commented. He gave no interviews. He published no summer reflections. But his gestures were as deliberate as they were serene. He released one dove each Sunday morning from the villa's inner garden, a quiet prayer for peace that floated into the Roman sky without fanfare. The people responded. A grassroots campaign called Sacred Rhythm took off online, encouraging Catholics to set aside 1 hour each week for holy stillness. Retreat houses filled. The Vatican bookstore's best-selling title became The Spiritual Wisdom of Quiet Popes. Teachers introduced classroom reflection time. Doctors, inspired by the retreat, encouraged spiritual rest as part of healing. And Castel Gandolfo? It blossomed. The gardens, once quiet, were now humming with bees and prayers. The chapel candles burned longer into the night, and the air, fresh with lake breeze and incense, carried not urgency, but invitation. The villa had ceased being a symbol of luxury. It had become a lighthouse of renewal. At its center stood a man who said nothing, who waved only when he meant it, who read, prayed, walked, and wept, for the church, for the tired, for the invisible. And in his silence, a world of restless believers heard something they didn't know they needed: permission to stop, permission to breathe, permission to be small again. And in that smallness, the greatest truth was heard, not from a pulpit, not in a tweet, but from the rhythm of a papal retreat that became quite simply a mirror for the soul. As the sun sets behind the ancient hills and the bells of Castel Gandolfo ring gently across the lake, one truth lingers. In a time of noise, Pope Leo XIV chose silence. In a culture of urgency, he chose rhythm. And in a world that equates worth with visibility, he quietly returned to a place where popes once rested, not to retreat from duty, but to return to it renewed. This wasn't a nostalgic revival, it was a prophetic move, a quiet revolution. A reminder that the most powerful thing a spiritual leader can do is not always to act, but to abide. Through long walks, early prayers, and silent nights under the stars, Leo XIV reminded the Church of something we often forget, that the soul cannot thrive at the pace of headlines, that contemplation is not retreat, it is mission's route. The revival of papal summers at Castel Gandolfo is not a footnote, it's a living testament. A living answer to the question, what does it mean to lead by example when the world isn't watching? At Think Fresh Daily, we believe stories like this matter, not because they change headlines, but because they change hearts. Pope Leo XIV's summer wasn't about escape, it was about alignment, with tradition, with nature, with God. And through his silence, he taught us to listen again. So stay with us. Subscribe to Think Fresh Daily, because the next time the world forgets the power of pause, we'll be here to remind it, with rhythm, with reverence, with truth that unfolds slowly like a sunrise over Lake Albano.